Throughout history, prison executions have often been shrouded in secrecy, yet some have emerged as particularly brutal, reflecting the darker aspects of human governance and conflict. One such harrowing episode is the Katyn massacre during World War II. In 1940, the Soviet NKVD executed approximately 22,000 Polish military officers and intelligentsia. The executions were meticulously planned. Prisoners were led individually into a soundproofed room, restrained, and shot in the base of the skull. This methodical approach ensured a rapid succession of killings, with Blokhin personally executing an average of one prisoner every 3 minutes over 28 consecutive nights. In the face of the advancing German army in 1941, the NKVD hastily evacuated prisons in occupied territories, leading to mass executions of inmates. In Berezowsk, prisoners were executed en masse in the prison's basements. Witnesses later discovered dozens of corpses, many showing signs of brutal torture, with ropes around their necks and hands tied. Similar atrocities occurred across Ukraine. In Lviv, the NKVD massacred over 4,000 prisoners in June 1941. Methods included shooting inmates in their cells, throwing grenades into crowded rooms, or starving them to death in cellars. Some victims were bayoneted and survivors were scarce. In Lutsk, after the prison was bombed, Soviet authorities promised amnesty to political prisoners to prevent escapes. As they lined up outside, they were machine-gunned by Soviet tanks. Those who survived the initial assault were forced to bury the dead before being executed themselves. The Gurla prison in Romania became infamous for its brutal treatment of inmates during the communist regime. Under the warden Petre Chigoiescu, the prison was transformed into a place of hard labor and violence. Notably, Ioan Flores, a 70-year-old politician, was beaten to death by fellow inmates acting under official orders. In more recent times, Syria's Sednaya prison has been labeled a slaughterhouse. Reports indicate that thousands of detainees were executed, with a discovered Book of Death listing nearly 30,000 individuals. Torture, rape, and mass hangings were reportedly commonplace, highlighting the regime's severe human rights violations. The United States has also grappled with the ethics of execution methods. After a 15-year hiatus, South Carolina resumed executions by firing squad. In a recent case, Brad Sigmund, convicted of double murder, chose this method over lethal injection due to concerns about the drug's effects. The execution was described as violent and sudden, reigniting debates about the humanity of various execution methods. Iran's Evin prison has long been associated with political repression. Recently, Mehdi Hassani, a 48-year-old father, faced imminent execution after being sentenced on fabricated charges. In a voice message to his daughter, he exposed the regime's brutality and the torture prevalent in the prison, highlighting the ongoing human rights abuses in the country. These instances, spanning different eras and regimes, underscore the persistent use of brutal prison executions as tools of oppression and control. They serve as stark reminders of the importance of safeguarding human rights and ensuring justice within penal systems worldwide. The Soviet Union under Stalin also conducted widespread political executions in the gulags. Prisoners accused of crimes against the state were often executed in freezing conditions, with some forced to dig their own graves before being shot. These executions were sometimes carried out in front of other inmates as a means of instilling fear. During the Cultural Revolution in China, mass executions of political prisoners were routine. Many were subjected to public struggle sessions before being taken to execution grounds. Some were forced to kneel while executioners fired shots to the back of the head, and in other cases, entire prison populations were wiped out in a single day. Nazi Germany's concentration camps also served as execution centers. While gas chambers were the primary method, individual executions were common. Prisoners were lined up and shot, hanged, or even subjected to cruel medical experiments before being killed. Auschwitz alone saw the execution of thousands through these methods. North Korea is notorious for its secretive prison camps where executions are carried out without trial. Prisoners accused of disloyalty to the regime have been executed in horrifying ways, including being torn apart by dogs or crushed by tanks in front of other inmates. Public executions are still used as a warning to citizens. Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge saw the infamous S-21 prison where thousands were tortured before being executed. Prisoners were often taken to the killing fields, blindfolded, and beaten to death with farming tools to save bullets. The brutality of these executions remains one of the darkest chapters in modern history. In the 18th and 19th centuries, British prisons also carried out brutal executions. Hanging was the most common method, but botched executions led to slow strangulation rather than a quick death. In some cases, executions were performed in front of massive crowds, turning death into a public spectacle. Medieval prisons across Europe were notorious for their gruesome executions. Prisoners sentenced to death were sometimes drawn and quartered, burned at the stake, or beheaded. The Tower of London became infamous for beheadings, including those of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. The Ottoman Empire employed brutal execution methods for prisoners deemed traitors. Some were impaled while others were drowned in weighted sacks. Janissaries who fell out of favor with the Sultan were sometimes strangled with silk cords, a method reserved for high-ranking officials. Under Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, political prisoners were executed in mass killings. Firing squads were common, but reports suggest that some prisoners were dropped into industrial shredders as a form of execution. The fear instilled by these brutal methods kept opposition to the regime at a minimum. In the 2000s, reports surfaced about botched lethal injections in the United States. Some inmates took over an hour to die, writhing in pain as execution drugs failed to work properly. These cases fueled debates about the ethics and effectiveness of capital punishment. Executions in Saudi Arabian prisons are carried out through public beheadings. Those sentenced to death, including political dissidents and drug offenders, are often executed in city squares. The use of swords in executions is one of the last remnants of medieval-style punishments still practiced today. In Mexico, cartels often execute prisoners in makeshift jails. Rivals or informants are tortured before being killed in gruesome ways, including decapitation and dismemberment. Some of these executions are filmed and spread online as warnings to others. During the French Revolution, the guillotine became the standard execution method. It was initially seen as a humane alternative to other brutal executions, but mass executions turned it into a symbol of terror. Entire prison populations were cleared out in a matter of days. The electric chair was once a common execution method in the US, but it was far from humane. Some executions resulted in prisoners catching fire or suffering prolonged agony. This led to its decline in favor of lethal injection, though some states still allow its use. Japan's Fukuoka prison saw mass executions during World War II. Prisoners, including Allied soldiers, were sometimes subjected to starvation before being executed. Torture was commonly used to extract confessions before executions were carried out. South Africa during apartheid carried out numerous secret executions of political prisoners. Hanging was the standard method, and prisoners were often executed in secrecy to avoid public outcry. Many executions were later found to have been politically motivated rather than based on actual crimes. The Soviet KGB carried out secret executions in underground prison chambers. Prisoners accused of treason were often shot in the back of the head in rooms designed to minimize blood splatter. These executions were methodical, designed to eliminate enemies of the state efficiently. The brutality of execution methods has often mirrored the political climate of the era, with regimes seeking to instill maximum fear among their citizens. In Stalin's Soviet Union, executions were not limited to gunshots. Some prisoners were locked in cells with no food or water, left to die slowly from starvation or dehydration. Others were subjected to extreme physical torture before their deaths, including beatings, electrocution, and forced exposure to freezing temperatures. These methods were not just about killing, but about demonstrating absolute power over life and death. The prison camps of Nazi Germany are infamous for their industrialized methods of execution. While gas chambers were the most well-known form of mass killing, thousands of prisoners were executed through more direct and violent means. Some were hanged with piano wire in a method designed to maximize suffering. Others were used for medical experiments before being injected with lethal doses of poison. Prison guards would sometimes execute inmates on a whim, using dogs to tear them apart or forcing them into gladiator-style fights where the loser would be shot. In Imperial Japan's Unit 731, prisoners were subjected to some of the most horrific executions imaginable. Captives, including Chinese civilians and Allied prisoners of war, were deliberately infected with diseases like the plague and cholera to study the effects. When they became too sick to be of further use, they were dissected alive without anesthesia. Others were exposed to frostbite experiments, their limbs frozen solid before being shattered. Once the research was complete, execution methods ranged from flamethrowers to live vivisections, ensuring maximum suffering. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia executed an estimated 2 million people during its reign of terror, many of them prisoners accused of opposing the regime. Tuol Sleng Prison, once a school, was converted into an interrogation and execution center. Prisoners were often taken to the killing fields where they were not shot but bludgeoned to death with shovels, axes, or wooden clubs to save bullets. Some were buried alive, while others were forced to kill each other as part of twisted experiments in obedience and psychological control. The dictatorship of Francisco Franco in Spain saw thousands of political prisoners executed between 1939 and 1975. Many were taken in the dead of night and lined up against prison walls before being shot by firing squads. Others were subjected to electric shocks, prolonged beatings, or forced to endure psychological torture before execution. Some executions were disguised as accidents, with prisoners thrown from high places or pushed in front of moving vehicles to make their deaths appear incidental. The prison system in North Korea is known for its extreme cruelty, with executions often carried out in public to serve as a warning to the population. Reports have described prisoners being tied to posts and executed with anti-aircraft guns, reducing their bodies to unrecognizable remains. Others have been burned alive, forced to stand on landmines, or drowned in barrels of water. These methods are deliberately chosen to maximize terror and reinforce the absolute authority of the ruling regime. In Saddam Hussein's Iraq, executions were often filmed and used as propaganda to intimidate political opponents. Some prisoners were forced to confess to crimes they did not commit before being shot on live television. Others were executed in secret prisons where they were subjected to mock executions multiple times before finally being killed. The regime's security forces sometimes used acid baths to dispose of bodies, ensuring that no trace of the prisoners remained. The practice of public execution in Iran continues today, with prisoners hanged from cranes in city squares. Some executions are deliberately botched to prolong suffering, with prisoners left dangling for minutes as they slowly asphyxiate. Reports have also emerged of prisoners being stoned to death, a punishment reserved for certain moral offenses. Before executions, many prisoners endure brutal torture, including whipping, prolonged stress positions, and severe beatings that leave them crippled. The use of execution as a form of entertainment was common in ancient Rome. Gladiators who refused to fight or prisoners convicted of treason were sometimes executed by being torn apart by wild animals in the Colosseum. Other forms of execution included crucifixion, where victims were nailed to wooden crosses and left to die over the course of several days. Some prisoners were burned alive in large iron cages, their screams drowned out by the cheers of the crowd. The medieval period saw some of the most grotesque executions in history. Prisoners were sometimes subjected to the breaking wheel, where their limbs were slowly shattered with iron bars before being left to die. Others were boiled alive, with executioners gradually increasing the water temperature to prolong agony. In cases of high treason, prisoners were drawn and quartered, meaning they were hanged until near death, disemboweled, and then torn apart by horses pulling in opposite directions. France's use of the guillotine was seen as a more humane alternative to hanging or burning at the stake, but in reality it became a symbol of terror. During the French Revolution, thousands of prisoners were executed in rapid succession, with heads piling up in the streets. Some reports suggest that severed heads remained conscious for several seconds after being cut off, with executioners noting blinking eyes and moving lips in the moments after decapitation. The British Empire conducted brutal executions in its colonial prisons, particularly in India, Ireland, and Africa. Hanging was the most common method, but prisoners were often left dangling for extended periods before they finally died. In some cases, prisoners were lashed hundreds of times before being hanged, ensuring they experienced maximum pain before their execution. The Empire also used mass executions as a tool of suppression, such as during the Indian Rebellion of 1857, where thousands of captured rebels were publicly blown apart by cannons. The secret police of the Ottoman Empire employed suffocation as a discreet execution method. Political prisoners and suspected traitors were placed in airtight rooms or locked in barrels filled with sand, where they slowly asphyxiated. This method left no visible wounds, making it ideal for eliminating enemies without arousing suspicion. In more extreme cases, prisoners were sewn into sacks with wild animals such as snakes or scorpions before being thrown into the sea. South American dictatorships of the 20th century, including those in Argentina and Chile, conducted death flights as a method of execution. Political prisoners were sedated, loaded onto military aircraft, and thrown into the ocean while still alive. This method ensured that no bodies could be recovered, making it nearly impossible for families to learn the fate of their loved ones. Some prisoners were first subjected to brutal beatings and torture, ensuring they were too weak to resist when thrown from the planes. The Eastern Bloc during the Cold War saw numerous secret executions carried out by intelligence agencies. The Stasi in East Germany used silenced pistols to execute political dissidents in isolated prison chambers. Some prisoners were locked in airtight gas chambers while others were poisoned with cyanide-laced food. These executions were meticulously recorded, with official documents often falsified to make deaths appear natural or accidental. Russia's use of execution as a political tool did not end with the fall of the Soviet Union. In modern times, defectors, journalists, and opposition figures have been poisoned with radioactive substances or nerve agents. Some dissidents have been kidnapped and disappeared, their bodies never found. The use of covert assassinations allows the government to maintain plausible deniability while still eliminating threats to its rule. In Africa, warlords and militant groups often carry out executions as a means of maintaining control. Prisoners captured by groups like Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab have been subjected to beheadings, immolation, and even crucifixion. Some executions are filmed and distributed online as propaganda tools aimed at instilling fear in both local populations and foreign governments. The history of execution in the United States has been marked by botched attempts, racial discrimination, and evolving methods. Electrocution was introduced as a supposedly more humane alternative to hanging, but many prisoners suffered excruciating deaths due to faulty equipment. Some were set on fire, while others took multiple shocks to finally die. In the 21st century, lethal injection has been increasingly scrutinized, with reports of prisoners experiencing prolonged suffering due to poorly mixed drugs. Throughout history, prison executions have served as tools of political oppression, fear, and control. Many regimes have used brutal methods to silence dissent and maintain their grip on power. While capital punishment still exists in many countries, the evolution of human rights continues to challenge its place in modern justice systems.